What is up, boys? Silver Surfer here, coming at you. Probably the last video for 2024. Christmas is upon us, so I thought I'd drop a little present for everyone out here. This is another video I've been wanting to do for a while, dealing with popping on decel. Now, I am not a fan of it myself. It just doesn't sound good. And maybe on some exhaust setups it would sound better than others, but at least for me, I just don't think it sounds very good. Now, my father-in-law had his buddy visit him. He just bought a C8, and as he was driving away, my father-in-law was like, "I think I heard it pop when he shifted gears." So, maybe to some people and in some circumstances, popping can be cool, I guess, but just general foot off the gas, decelerating, I'm not a fan. So that's why I say don't do it. So let's talk about it. The biggest a misconception, I think, is it's caused by a rich mixture, meaning, hey, we burned all the fuel we could in the cylinder, and then everything else that couldn't be burned, well, that just exploded inside the exhaust. That is actually not the case. 9 times or 99 times out of 100, it's always going to be due to a lean mixture. And why is that? Simply because lean mixtures are harder to ignite and they are harder to keep combusting, right? So initiation and sustentation of that combustion is hard, and that leads to a partial misfire. So basically, raw fuel never gets combusted inside the cylinder, and it pops on its way out from the either hot exhaust valve or just the exhaust runner itself, or somewhere inside the manifold where all of a sudden the fact that it's lean, it doesn't matter because it's just overwhelmed by this exceedingly high temperature that it doesn't matter. It just pops. And so that's typically what happens on a carburetor. It's lean. So for EFI, which applies to us, there are going to be some other issues at play here. So yes, lean mixtures can still be a problem. Typically, I think that's going to be more in your open loop type scenario, because once you're in closed loop, it's going to want to keep it at that stoichiometric ratio. But, you know, vacuum leaks, exhaust leaks, but also on tip in, so transient fueling, if your virtual VE isn't dialed in or your transients aren't dialed in, that can cause it. So obviously the fixes here is going to be fix your leaks, tune your stuff, and rich and open loop as needed. Another issue that can cause popping, and this is just general popping, not necessarily on decel, right? But just to cover all of our bases here, is just some fuel injector issues. So LSA injectors spray at an angle that's bespoke to the LSA intake design, but you may have a poor spray pattern due to clogged injectors. Maybe they're propane injectors. Heck, maybe your fuel pressure is low or something like that, or just your fuel injector is wrong. But you can also have some popping caused by other transient issues, right? So anytime that fuel hits the intake manifold runner or the cylinder head intake port, um, and it sticks to it, well, liquid fuel doesn't burn very well, if at all, right? So that can drip and dribble into the cylinder where it won't be burned, only to be expelled later and potentially lead to popping, right? So proper injector data is paramount, right? That's is the going to be the foundation for any good running tune. And obviously, a proper intake manifold and proper injectors as well. All right, so now the heart of the matter, what we're going to talk about today. Typically, what you're going to see for the fuel injected stuff is when you have excessively retarded cam timing during deceleration. Um, and that can come from deceleration fuel cutoff or clutch fuel cutoff, and also to some extent poor EOIT tuning. And that's basically going to be when fuel short circuits, right? So during overlap, fuel is sprayed. It never really gets trapped inside the cylinder and it just goes right down the exhaust and you get a little pop, right? So we're going to discuss the ignition timing during decel and how to control that to control this, as well as some DFCO stuff. End of injection target. Hopefully, you've been a member of the channel long enough. You've seen my videos on that and the free software that I have contributed to the community, all of which you can use to tune that stuff. All right. So, why is it? Uh, why should it be avoided? Now, and again, this is subjective, right? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I don't like that sound. The Honda boys, I think they like it. So it's just not my cup of tea. But, it's pretty much an indication that the tune isn't accurate. It's not perfect, right? There are flaws and defects in that tune, and that's going to lead to that popping. If it is excessive, you can start damaging stuff, right? When you retard the ignition timing, that's going to cause that fuel to burn as it's in the exhaust manifold and on its way out of the valve. You could cook the exhaust valve in extreme situations, but it's also going to put a lot of heat downstream, and it also is going to generate a shock wave. Now, I'm not saying just because you get a few pops here and there that you're going to wreck your cats or your O2s, but just be cognizant that those shock waves and that extra heat are going to do some wear and tear. They're going to take their toll out on those components. All right, so how do we fix the tune? All right, so DFCO, we're cutting the fuel off during deceleration. And also as part of that, it's also going to retard the ignition timing. So number one, your best bet here is just disable DFCO. Most tuners are going to do that. It does make tuning a little bit harder as far as collecting logs and looking at the data. You're going to have really rich areas in there due to DFCO, and you can try to filter those out, but maybe when you're all done with tuning, if you want to re-enable DFCO, okay, but at least for the tuning process, probably want to disable it. You can also, if you do like some tasteful, one, two, or three little micro pops here and there on decel, you can fine tune DFCO to do that for you. All right. So first thing, we'll go to the fuel tab and we're going to go to cut off DFCO. And you can see the settings up here in this red box. This would be one way that you can disable it, raising the temperature and raising the RPMs where you can't ever hit those conditions. So you're going to disable it. All right. So first thing we have here is the blend time. Now this time is not milliseconds. This is in crank pulses. So you can see as we go up the RPM scale, the crank pulses increase. This is just the delay. And then we have the entry spark. So we're going to wait this many crank pulses. And then once we have done that, we will retard ignition timing to this value. And so you can see that we have 10 degrees. This is a reasonable and moderate amount of timing. I would say 5 degrees probably is going to be the lowest you're going to want. Once you start getting 0 and definitely negative degrees, that is where you're going to start hearing pops. But 10, you should not have any problems. And then the next one is this fuel cut delay. Now you'll notice these are all zeros. So this is saying as soon as you let off the throttle, cut the fuel immediately, right? So we should go instantly, no fuel, and then we're going to wait this many crank pulses. Presumably, this is to allow any fuel that's trapped within, transient fuel, right, that's trapped onto the port walls or intake runners to either dribble in the cylinder or evaporate, just kind of clear the pipes, so to speak, right? That's my guess. So as long as this is 0 and this is a positive value, you should not get any pops. Now, if you want to start adding a few tasteful pops, what should you do? Probably you're going to want to make this delay just a little bit bigger than this. So in other words, we will cut timing first down to this value, and then we will cut fuel down to this value. And then you're probably going to want to make this value a little bit smaller. Maybe you can start at 0 degrees. And then as you go down through the RPM range, you could start reducing this number to eliminate the pops. Now, again, that's if you want to do tasteful, but me, I would leave it like this: 0 across the board, 10 degrees, and then you should have no pops from DFCO. The clutch fuel cutoff, this is when you push the clutch, what timing should be used. You can see here the lowest value is 5. We shouldn't really get any sparks. This is going to help the RPMs drop. So when you push the clutch in, it'll help you rev match, hopefully, a little bit easier. So as long as this isn't negative, you should be fine. And I wouldn't go below 5 either. All right, now the main thing, the popping due to deceleration, air, and spark. So let's kind of look at this timeline of events here, right? So we have a deceleration event. Do we hit DFCO? If so, maybe we could have a pop. But if it's disabled, right, we can just ignore this. Next, we're going to hit our rolling RPMs, and then we're going to attempt to hit that RPM using air and fuel, or I should say air and spark. And so this is where we could have a potential pop. So first thing you're going to want to check is this rolling idle RPM. All right, this is going to be our target, and we're going to cover tuning this in a second. And then here's what the spark does. Now, in in normal idle mode, meaning you're in park or in gear, foot's on the brake, you're just sitting there, not moving. The ECM should be using spark first as its number one tool in its toolbox to correct idle RPM, and then it should be using air to achieve that RPM. Using spark is fast, using air is slow. During deceleration, I'm not sure if that algorithm, so to speak, is being used. It may be using air first, or it may be using spark and air at the same time. But either way, we're going to assume that it does use spark first, right? So its first thing is, well, what idle, decel timing should I target? What should I start at? What's my initial starting point? And that's the idle spark advance for the coast down table. And then it's going to say, well, am I higher or lower than the rolling idle RPM? If it's higher or lower, it'll use overspeed or underspeed. And then it's going to look at this minimum final spark base table and say, am I trying to go lower than this table will allow? If if it is, then it will say, all right, well, then I can't use it. I have to use the value here in the base table. If we go too far negative, we get a pop. Next is we're going to correct with airflow. Now we have this other, I put in this little dummy table in here, and I don't think this is a table. I think this is really an algorithm that takes in a lot of different things into account. Virtual torque, max base timing, a few other things to arrive at what is my idle steady state airflow. Now, HB Tuners, as far as I know, hasn't really mapped much of anything of what influences this. And not only that, to make matters worse, they did not map this PID in the scanner for all operating systems. Only a handful of ECMs have this mapped. So just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there, but it is there. So this is the starting point, right? Just like we have the coast down spark, this is going to be our steady state idle prediction air for all circumstances, whether we're coast down or we are parked. Then we invoke or engage the proportional and the integral here, right, to determine are we higher or lower than we need to be? How do we want to correct it? And then we also have this airflow final minimum, which just like our minimum final spark is going to say, are you trying to use some air that is less than I have said is the limit? Okay. And if we reach this limit, right, and it's not low enough, then it'll take a lot longer time for the RPMs to drag, especially if our minimum final spark is high and this is high. Maybe it takes forever to idle down. Sometimes you have a engine that wants to drive itself and we can't really stop it. So if we map this out, this is what it looks like. Our starting values up here. We have our adaptives over here. And then we have these imposed limits, right? The minimum final numbers here. Now, again, this is why I know I've said this before, and I'll say it again. A lot of people begin their idle tuning journey by this minimum final airflow, right? This is the final check and balance of our system of, hey, we're just making sure we're playing, coloring between the lines here, right? And I don't think that this really should be people's primary idle tuning value. The ECM uses it last. If you fix this and if you know kind of how to influence the steady state, you'll be better off. And by the way, I did make a few videos a while ago on the idle integral air in which I cover this a little bit more. So you may want to watch those if you haven't. So this is how the whole system kind of works together. So if we look at this, right, here are three examples of how we could hit our target RPMs, right? We could use a ton of air and retard the spark a lot, and that's bad. That's going to cause us popping. We could have a more balanced approach, which is okay. This is going to generate a lot of heat in the exhaust. This is maybe a moderate amount of heat. And then here we're really using air as our primary idle control. And by saying using air, we're saying we're going to cut back as much air as possible so that we can maintain a lot of ignition advance, right? And this is going to keep torque a little bit higher for us, hopefully, to come out of that idle condition. It will prevent popping and it will prevent heat from building up. All right, so another thing to kind of consider, normal idle tuning, right? Just in park or in gear, that engine is really fighting a ton of frictional losses, just in the rotating mass of the torque converter filled with the fluid, all the shafts inside the transmission, the cam lobe is wandering all over the place, the frictional losses. And that's hard, but coast down is kind of the opposite, right? Instead of the crank driving everything. Now we have the momentum of the car. Those rear wheels are really trying to turn the crank and the engine's trying to slow it down, right? And that's a lot of inertia to overcome. So it's, the opposite, right? Here we're trying to not necessarily speed up the RPMs, but maintain. But here is we're trying to decrease RPMs and we're fighting a battle of negative friction, I suppose you could say. All right, so what would be the first step? All right, so we'll just call this level one. Maybe I should have said stage one. So the first thing is let's increase the rolling RPM. So a lot of times what I see is people will put the RPMs the same all the way across the top here. And if you're rolling at 75 miles per hour and you let off the throttle, um, that's 850 RPMs is a pretty unrealistic target. So I would suggest that you need to start a little bit higher, more reasonable, and walk this down. Now, this is all of this is for folks who have a moderately aggressive cam. If you have a factory cam, it's, probably going to be a lot easier to tune this stuff out. And, your idle settings and air settings and spark settings are all going to be vastly different. So I'm not suggesting that you copy any of this stuff out, but at least know here are the factors involved, and then you can kind of work on your own recipe to get this under check. But in this case, we're going to say, hey, 1300 RPMs. And then as speed decreases, you can see once we hit 42 miles an hour, now we start coming down off of that high point, and then we gradually walk it down. What I would not do is have it too high here at the last value and then all of a sudden drop really low. That could lead to some weird idle oscillations or stalling issues. So you want to have a nice gradual smooth transition here. Similarly, when we look at the minimum final airflow, we would think that we would want to do the same thing, right? In my opinion, this is what I see a lot, right? And this is probably everyone's starting point where, hey, we're going to have, obviously, if we want to maintain a high idle, right? If we go back, 1300 RPMs. I don't know. We'll just have a stab in the dark. We'll call this 18 grams per second. And then we'll just gradually walk this down. But this is too high of an airflow, right? We want to cut the airflow so that spark remains high. So here you can see here in my larger highway gears, 4, 5, and 6, I have this set to 4 grams. And then as we get into the lower gears, then we bump it up a little bit, and then actually then we increase it here at the end to kind of jump things up. Because if you keep it too low here in these lower gears as you slow down to a stop sign, there's a chance that it may stall or bobble or, kind of start to oscillate. So we want to walk it back up to where we want to. So again, just looking at how this normally is, or not how it normally is, but kind of how I have my car set up, right? Here's our highway gear is here really low and it kind of jumps up, and then This is like park in reverse, but either way, then you can see the lower gears kind of bridge this gap a little bit more elegantly. So just something to think about. Again, I'm not suggesting that you put this same thing in your car, but at least kind of see kind of how I would tackle it. The next thing. So if you do that and it's better or maybe no change, what are the next steps that you can look at? So if you go down to your idle overspeed table for the coast down, you can look at these values in here. What are they? Do you see -20 in here? If so, that's probably a lot, right? So you may want to limit this. Now, this is relative, right? This isn't saying during deceleration use -6.5. This is saying, what does your idle coast down spark table say? And then add -6 or subtract -6 from that value. So if I'm coasting down and it's commanding 40, well, this is going to be 40 minus 6.5. That's going to be 39.5 total degrees. So make sure these values up here aren't excessively large. The next thing is going to be looking at your minimum final spark table. And by the way, I would say that probably use stock values in here. I'm not suggesting that you go in here with your paintbrush and just start, going to town, right? Ideally, you are going to use the stock values for these coast down tables and the same thing for your stock values for the minimum final spark. And understand the coast down area is going to be up here, right? And probably these top two rows. And depending on your cam, depending on your rolling idle RPMs, is going to determine, your cylinder air mass, right? Um, so just look at this area here. And if this is really negative, this is going to allow the ECM to go that deep into the timing retard to allow popping, which we don't want. So you can see here in this example, worst case scenario, we're only going to hit 5 degrees positive timing. So you can look at this as well, make sure that this is in check. All right, now level 3. This is not something that I'm suggesting that you do, but if you reach the end of your rope, you're willing to accept some risks and failure and go on a long learning journey, then you can work on this stuff. And this is dealing with the adaptive uh, proportional and integral or PI controller. Generally speaking, you never want to edit this stuff. So many new people are going to try to tackle their idle problems by start plugging in random numbers in here, even if you just multiply by a certain percent. Don't do that. Your best bet is to use stock values, GM approved, that work. This is a highly complex system. I'm, I really am advising you not to do this. But I have done this to some extent and either found a little bit of relief or no real change at all. So the first thing is we have this coast down here. So this is saying, and if you watch those other videos that I mentioned before about the idle integral error, you're going to see the integral is far more reactive to errors in the idle RPM than proportional. Proportional is pretty weak in the idle scheme, right? If it's if it is pulling out or adding 1 gram of air, that's a lot for proportional. You may see integral, like you look at these values, this is -10 and that's +13, at least for the coast down. You can see that these values are pretty high. So the first thing that you can do is if you go in here to this airflow limits and the coast down one here for low, you can make this more negative. So like change this -10 to maybe, you know, -15. Now I don't know if your OS has -10 or whatever it has, but I'm just saying an example, you can make it more negative. So this is not the same thing as the minimum final air table. This is just saying how much leeway are we allowing the integral to throw in the ring for its idle correction. So again, this is going to be relative to that idle steady state. So if idle steady state says 20 grams of air, we're saying we'll allow this to pull down negative or add -10, right? So we could pull it from idle steady state from 20 to 10 grams of air. So you can bump this up. The other area that you can change maybe is And this is definitely way more advanced. And this is where you're really going to start running into issues, is starting to change these coefficients. So for the coast down row, if you make these more negative for the proportional or more positive for the integral table, I would only do this for the higher RPM errors, right? And that's going to be that initial when you let off the throttle and it's trying to correct using air, and then maybe use whatever your stock values are for the lower values. So this will cut the air out a little bit quicker at that beginning of the deceleration event, and then it will kind of return to a normal setting here where it will more gracefully recover. Because if you start jacking with these coefficients, you're going to run into all kinds of wonky idle stuff. So again, only do the high error areas. All right, so when you're driving, if you're looking, here's what you can look at. Now, I have a reference line here for 0 degrees of timing. And you can see here's our throttle pedal, right? And we cut the throttle, and then boom, all of a sudden our timing goes to -4. And down here it gets to like -5 or -6, right? This thing is popping this pretty much the entire time. So this is what you can look for. Now, you can also set up your scanner, and I'll do a live demo of this, of some things to look at. Now, let's take a look at a couple logs here side by side. So on the left side, I have a bad log, and on the right side, we have a good log. Our first thing that we have to look at is really spark. So we can look at the evidence here, right? So by the way, here's how I set these up. I suppose I'll put this layout in my Google Drive. You can download it. Look at the video description. But here's we're just looking at Spark Advance, and I do have you don't need to get this exotic, but I did put in kind of my normal transient filter out. But if we look in here, we have accelerator position is 0%, and then I just did where vehicle speed is over 5 miles an hour, just to make sure that we are out of the normal idle routine, right? So we're coast down. And then we just have our RPMs here. This is, I grabbed from the minimum final spark table. And then we have our transmission gear logged down here. So we can look at where we're at all the way on this thing here. So you can see that we're got the reds here. That's going to be where our popping is occurring. Compared to over here, which is a vastly different story, right? Our spark stays high and it maintains that a lot of advance in here. And then I also have the errors logged in here. Now this log, we don't have all of them in here. Well, maybe, well, some of them. But here in this log, we have the steady state error. This is going to be the one most likely you don't have. But the real trick, if we look at this idle desired error, which again, you probably don't have, but understand that this is the final result of, let's take the steady state error at any given time, let's add proportional to it, let's add integral to it, and then this is the result. Your goal is to make sure that this number is always going to be higher than the minimum final error. So this is our basement, right? We can't go lower than this. So if our actual desired air is lower than our minimum final air, then we've bottomed out on air. And then our only option then is to just pull out as much spark as we can until we hit the limits there. But otherwise, all these other tables are set up the same way, right? If we look here in the graphs layout, have the same filters in here and then all of the same the layout here for RPMs and everything. And this way, then you can start looking at that minimum final error table as well as the minimum final spark table, and then start addressing the airflow as needed. The only other thing, I did put these on the minimum values here, so that way we're sure to see worst case scenario of where we need to be. All right, so make sure you check the Google Drive if you want to download and reuse this as well. Well, that wraps up another one. Last for the year. Appreciate you watching. If you have not hit that like and subscribe button, I would appreciate it if you do so. And honestly, the more that I think about it, as much as I like cars and I think chicks dig cars, I think the reality is chicks dig boats more than they dig cars. I don't know where I went wrong. But anyway, I think it's time for me to get a boat. I think, honestly, the thing that's holding me back, well, a few things, but one is I got to pick out a cool name. This guy named his boat Horrified. I'm not sure what he's horrified about, like gas prices or what. Oh,